All right, we are going to get started. I would like to thank everybody for braving the elements and coming to this conversation about marijuana that is put on by the Board of Health in conjunction with the Planning Board and the Police Department. My role tonight is more or less to just run the timer. We're going to try to keep to a very strict schedule and let everyone make their presentations. And in that same light, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until the end of all of the speakers. They'll all have their chance to make their presentations. And then afterwards, at 8:10, promptly at 8:10, we're going to have an open discussion, and we'll take questions at that time. If you are shy, well, get over it. But also, if you're shy, we'll have cards, and you can write down your questions, and we will get somebody, maybe I will ask the questions in an anonymous way so you don't have to stand up in front of everybody and do so. Everybody's bios are on the back of the program which you have, so to save time, I'm not going to introduce our panel, but all of the panel are very distinguished and knowledgeable in their field, so this is going to be an interesting discussion. And I don't have to tell everybody to be polite and civil, regardless of what side you are on this issue. We're here this evening to learn and then hopefully ask some thoughtful questions and then learn some more. So, we are going to now hear from Mary Beth Murphy of the Rockport Board of Health, who is going to give us a little bit of an overview and talk to us about some of the state and local laws.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm actually not an expert on any of this, to be perfectly frank. We have some wonderful people up here volunteering their time who are experts. All I am is a person with an opinion and a person who's learned a lot about this. And what I know is that I grew up in Rockport, and being a person who grew up in Rockport, I know that this town is very proud of the fact that we make our own decisions. We make our own decisions about alcohol. We were late in making that decision. And I feel like when we voted in 2016, and I voted for marijuana to be sold recreationally in the state, I wasn't aware that we were automatically voting for recreational marijuana shops in Rockport. And that's in fact what we were voting for. So when I learned that, I feel like as a member of the Board of Health that the people of Rockport should have a sort of do-over and say, okay, now that we know what all the issues are, is this something that we want in our town? And so the only way we can really do this is by having a paper ballot vote for a ban. Okay, so if the ban fails, that means we allow marijuana shops in this town. So the process is this. At the town meeting this Saturday, there's going to be a question whether or not to put the ban on the ballot for our May vote. I'm here to encourage everybody, regardless of how you feel about this issue, to vote to put the ban on so that the people in this town can make their voices be heard one way or the other. That's really all I have to say. You're going to hear different opinions on both sides of the issue here tonight, but that's all I really care about as the newest member of the Board of Health, is that the people in Rockport get to make the decision on their own, knowing full well what they're voting for. So that's all I have.
Thank you. And that was 1 minute and 52 seconds. So far you are the leader in the being succinct competition. The prize will be handed out a little bit later this evening. I'll tell you later. Next, we are going to hear from the chairman of the Planning Board, Dr. Herman Lilia, and he's going to give a backdrop to the town meeting articles. And I was planning on talking a little bit about that, but he is going to do it, and we're going to start whenever you're ready, Herm.
Okay. Good evening. Yes, this is a backdrop to the articles for town meeting. It's not an effort to try to bore you or overwhelm you. It's an effort to try to set the stage so that when we get to town meeting, you'll understand the articles more clearly than you would otherwise. So, let's see what I do. Okay. So here's an overview of legalization of marijuana in Massachusetts. We can see here that medical and recreational marijuana, legal use of medical marijuana was established in 2012 and recreational in 2016. The licenses for all of this is controlled by the state. And we do have the authority in town to do a certain amount of control. But anyway, medical marijuana can be located in any town or city. However, recreational marijuana can be controlled and can be banned by a town or city, if the vote is in that favor. Regulation for medical marijuana is under local control, and regulation for recreational marijuana is under local control. And I'll explain a little bit more about local control in a moment. Let's see here. Okay, so backdrop to the town meeting vote, marijuana for us will relate to marijuana establishments. So that includes retail sale, but it also includes laboratory for the testing of marijuana, areas or companies that might come into town to attempt to grow marijuana in different facilities. So it's more than just recreational marijuana establishments, but of course the emphasis is to try to control marijuana establishments for recreational and retail sale. So the town meeting vote on marijuana establishments affords the opportunity to restart this process, to reconsider what in fact we're about. It's clear, I think, that when we voted in 2016, we did not understand that our willingness to legalize marijuana in the state of Massachusetts also meant that it was going to be potentially for sale in our town. And that was determined by the vote in the town. So if the town voted more than 50% in favor of legalization in the state, they had also approved of the sale of marijuana, recreational marijuana in that town, unless something additional was done, such as ban it. So then town meeting vote is a first step in a two-step process with regard to changing your mind about the recreational sale of marijuana in Rockport, per se. And that has to be a vote at a town meeting because we were one of those towns that had a vote initially that was over 50%. It ends up being this two-step process. And the first is to vote at town meeting. And if you vote to ban at the town meeting, then it goes on the ballot on May 15th. So that's the second step. So then there are the zones. Where would you locate it? Where would you locate it in town? So Rockport has 7 zones. We have those that are strictly residential. So single residential AA, single residential, and residential A are principally residences. In fact, probably solely in the case of single residential AA. But then in the case of residential, it's residences and business. Semi-residential is the same, residences and business. General, which is, there's only one zone, general, which is the old Cape Ann Tool Company. So that's essentially business plus residential. And then downtown is business plus residential. So here are these zones, just to give you an idea as to what this is all about. Here's the general zone, Pigeon Cove. Here is the downtown zone in red. There's a little bit of semi-residential up around the train station. Also, this green area down here, which goes out of town along Upper Main Street. It's semi-residential on one side, it's residential on the other side, a little bit confused. So those 3 areas would be principal locations for a business if in fact it could be approved. The zoning board of appeals would have to approve a business in a semi-residential area, but it does occur. So the principal focus for us after looking at this area, which is, again, general, but cited for a condo across the street, if the people who own Cape Ann Tool would move in a particular direction, then all of that would be residential conceivably. The semi-residential has this problem of discontinuity, and whether or not, because Upper Main Street is mostly residential, whether a pot shop or a retail outlet for marijuana on Upper Main is a good idea. But there are a number of, of course, vacant shops in the downtown area. So that became the focus as we looked at it, as the planning board looked at it, that an outlet would probably be located here. We had the, control to locate pot shops in the more desirable areas and avoid less desirable. We did, and there are some circles here which indicate an early consideration of 500 feet around the churches in town, 500 feet around the park. And basically what happened there was that you consumed all of the downtown district. We also banned pot shops in our initial considerations from Bearskin Neck. But the state does say in the guidelines that you can't be so restrictive as to make it impossible for an organization that wants to open a recreational or a retail marijuana outlet. So to, in a sense, set up these 500 feet on bans around parks and 200 feet around schools and churches, and then say that the whole end of Bearskin Neck is off limits, it left us with only a few little small areas as sort of in between, and that wouldn't fly. It simply wouldn't go. So we then said that downtown's it, but we'll go, there's a daycare center in the Congregational Church, so we'll go 200 feet from the Congregational Church, and that will really be the only restrictive area in downtown. So that's the backdrop. Oh, and this shows it better. So you can see these areas that we played with, and this area right here in the middle is in fact around the Congo Church, 200 feet out. So, okay, that's probably all I'll say from here. Wait a minute, okay. So anyway, now the recreational marijuana establishment, Article P, can go either of three ways. Disapproval on or at town meeting would mean there would be no issue on the May 15th ballot, and recreational sales in Rockport would be supported.
8 minutes.
If the approval passes on town ballot, then it's put on the May 15th ballot. Disapproval on May 15th, again, recreational sales would occur in Rockport. If it's approved on the May 5th, rather at town meeting, put on the May 15th ballot, approval, recreational sales would be defeated. So Article Q, location of marijuana establishments. Purpose of this is to include bylaws for medical marijuana treatment centers, as well as non-medical recreational retailers. And the zoning district for marijuana establishments needs to be determined regardless of the vote on recreational ban, because the medical marijuana treatment centers could also be placed in town. So medical marijuana is subject to state and not local approval, and still possible in Rockport regardless of the vote on
9 minutes.
P. Okay, local control for medical marijuana is much the same as for non-medical. Guidelines for sale need to be established regardless of the vote on medical or marijuana establishments. Medical marijuana treatment centers subject to state approval and guidelines that we can determine as location, daily hours, security, and signage. So here's non-medical marijuana. It's the same thing, same kind of guidelines that we can in fact impose. So basically it. Do you have any questions?
Which we will write them down or think about them, and we'll have them after.
Okay.
9 minutes and 44 seconds. Nice.
Okay.
also get a prize. So, everybody who is here tonight, you will be going to town meeting on Saturday. It's going to be a lot of fun. There are, as Herm said, there are 4 articles dealing with this issue. All of the articles to pass require a 2/3 vote because they're all zoning articles. So Article P is the ban. And for that to get onto a ballot requires a 2/3 vote at town meeting to get on the May 15th meeting. And Q, R, and S are all dealing with zoning districts, and R and S dealing with time, place, and manner restrictions, which are things that the Commonwealth allows us to regulate. So town meeting will be the place to deal with all of this. And now we are going to hear from Dr. Sydney Jimenez from the Mass General Hospital. She's going to talk about health and mental health risks, particularly in our youth. Go.
So I'm speaking as a physician. Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm going to be speaking as a physician in addiction medicine, as a mother of 3 adolescents, and as a lifelong resident in Rockport. And I am concerned about the possible public health impact that a pot shop or pot shops could have on our community, especially in our adolescents. I believe that the narrative has swung from one extreme to the other, and the narrative right now is that in many circles that marijuana is a benign drug with little to no adverse health risks, and there's basically it's been touted to treat almost every ailment that one might encounter. So I think definitely the narrative has shifted, and I think our adolescents are definitely hearing this narrative, which is why, according to the Monitoring the Future survey, which is a survey done annually on 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, about 12% of 8th graders have used marijuana in the past year, and 35% of 12th seniors have used marijuana in the past year. 6% of them are using daily, and 71% of them believe that marijuana is harmless. And what's important to remember is that marijuana is a drug of abuse and can be harmful, and like other drugs of abuse, it can cause addiction, and its mechanism of action of addiction is the same as that of other drugs of abuse. It triggers a dopamine release in a reward center, which is experienced as pleasurable, and with repeated exposures, especially in adolescence, this can lead to a series of adaptations that occur in the brain that can lead to a full-blown substance use disorder or addiction, which just briefly is an uncontrolled compulsive use of a drug despite harm. And so I want to the marijuana, particularly the THC component, which Wanda is going to talk about, which is a psychoactive component of the drug, binds to the cannabinoid receptors, which are quite abundant in our brains. And they're there, of course, not for us to smoke marijuana, but they're there because they play a really important role in normal brain functioning in many areas. Areas of cognition, alertness, reward, memory, motor coordination. And we also know that they absolutely play a vital role in normal brain development. We now know that the adolescent brain continues to mature and develop up until the age of 25, some say 26. And the brain matures from the back to the front. The prefrontal areas are the last to mature, and these are the areas that are important for executive function, for decision-making, impulse control. And throughout adolescence, the cannabinoid system is absolutely crucial. The number of receptors goes up, and it's very important for sort of all of the fine-tuning that occurs in the brain to optimize the brain for adult function. And marijuana, the THC, disrupts these processes. So if one is addicted to, if one is intoxicated with marijuana, it's not surprising that one will have more difficulty with concentration, with alertness, with memory, with motor control. And if one is a young person in school, they're going to have more difficulty with learning. And if you're behind the wheel of a car or even a boat, you may be at increased risk for accident. So how addictive is it? Well, we know that not every person that's exposed to a drug becomes addictive. It depends on many factors. It depends on genetic risk. It depends on the age of use, number of exposures, which is related to accessibility of the drug, and it's related to perception of harm of the drug, as well as the characteristics of the drug itself. According to NIDA, which is the National Institute of Drug Abuse, of marijuana users, about 9% will go on to develop a marijuana use disorder. This increases to about 16% if you're exposed to marijuana below the age of 17. And of daily users, adolescent users, this skyrockets to 25 to 50% risk of addiction, which is really the population that I'm seeing now as adults in the clinic. So, in young users, it's also important to point out that there may be an increased use in young users of developing other substance use disorders. There's also a high association between other mental health disorders such as bipolar, anxiety, depression in the youth. And there's increased risk for psychosis, especially with the marijuana of today, which is very different from that of previously. It has much higher THC content, and it places people at much higher risk of psychosis. And in people that are actually vulnerable to developing schizophrenia, it's believed that adolescent use exposure to the THC will cause manifestation of the schizophrenia 6 to 7 years earlier, and the course of the disease will be much more severe. So why is marijuana harmful? Well, it's also important to point out that marijuana research is really in its infancy, and we don't have that much research on adolescents, but we do have studies using sensitive imaging techniques such as functional MRI and PET scans that do show both functional and structural changes in the brain. We have studies that show the concentration of receptors, the receptor density of the cannabinoid receptors, again, which is so important to normal brain function and development. The density of the receptors is decreased in regular marijuana users. We have other studies looking at actual brain volumes, tissue volumes, and one study looking at adults who use marijuana regularly found decreased tissue volume in both the hippocampus and the amygdala. The amygdala being important for emotion and implicated in anxiety, and the hippocampus being important for memory and learning. We even have some studies that have actually looked at the neurocircuitry of the brain in users, and the actual connections themselves have been found to be affected. One study showed that the connectivity in regular marijuana users across the corpus callosum, which is the tract that connects the two sides of our brain, that there was decreased connectivity in the corpus callosum as well as connectivity to the hippocampus, which again is so important for learning and memory. So what does all of this mean? We're still trying to figure that all out, but it's instructive to know that there are actual functional and structural changes. There have also been studies looking at the association of adolescent use of marijuana and cognition, and one very well-cited study followed over 1,000 individuals from birth to age 38, and what they measured their IQ at age 13 at baseline and again at 38, and what they found is in the group of users who started marijuana early and used daily or weekly, so frequent use, had up to an 8-point IQ drop, which is dramatic. Other studies have attempted to look at the long-term sequela of marijuana use, and many of these studies have shown an increased risk of dropping out of high school, decreased likelihood of going to college, increased risk of developing a marijuana use disorder, of developing depression, and being welfare dependent. So
8 minutes.
So to be fair, I'm citing some of the studies that are quite dramatic, and not all studies have been this dramatic, and some studies have been more mixed in their results. But what is really important to know is that these studies have been done using the marijuana of before, the very low THC content marijuana, 3 to 4%. And as Wanda's going to discuss, the THC content has continually been manipulated to higher and higher levels to 12%, up to, I think, 20%, and in some of these concentrated preparations, up to 80%. And we know that the THC is really felt to be the neurotoxic, more damaging component, especially in the adolescent brain. So I would propose, given that policy has really gotten ahead of the science, I would propose a more cautious approach. To me, it's very important to first do no harm. And I think, so I would really hope that people vote, at least to bring it to a paper ballot so that we have more time to discuss some of the risks and benefits.
Thank you. Also, under 10 minutes. We're next going to hear from Dr. Bruce Cohen from the Rockport Board of Health, who is the former director of the Division of Research and Epidemiology. Didn't think I could say it, did you? Bureau of Health Statistics, Mass Department of Public Health. Dr. Cohen.
Thanks, Bob. Rockport is a great place to raise our kids. It's a great place to grow old. It's a great place to enjoy nature. It's a great place to shop and enjoy music and the arts. No one wants to see that changed. No one wants to see an increase in drug use among our kids. No one wants to see an increase in crime in our community. The bottom line is, if we cite a medical marijuana dispensary or a recreational pot shop here in our town, there won't be any dramatic changes in our community. There won't be an epidemic of teen drug use, and the effect on public safety will be the same whether there's a pot shop here or not. So how did I reach these conclusions? Well, as Bob said, I'm an epidemiologist. I've been doing health research studies for 40 years, and I've been reviewing studies for just about that long. And I wanted to use this approach to address this issue. So I reviewed the most recent scientific literature about the impact of legalizing marijuana for communities like ours. And I'm going to briefly summarize what I found. First, what does the current public health research show about the impact of legalizing marijuana laws on adolescent use? For years, people have debated whether legalizing marijuana would lead to an increased use by teens of marijuana. The most recent research found that teen use of marijuana does not change when the drug is legalized for medical purposes, and this was based on a review done just last year. There have been fewer studies that looked at recreational marijuana, but the best one was done by the Colorado Health Department. And the state health department showed marijuana use hasn't increased since legalization in Colorado. 4 out of 5 high school students continue to say they don't use marijuana even occasionally. So these numbers give the strongest indication that the fears of skyrocketing adolescent use have not materialized in any state where marijuana has been legalized. There's a simple reason why legalization hasn't affected teen use. Adolescents already reported that marijuana is widely available to them. Nationally, roughly 80% of 12th graders say that pot is easy to get. And the kids who want to use pot are probably already doing so. So having a pot shop here in Rockport wouldn't affect that at all. The second important public health question, particularly for our kids, is whether marijuana is a gateway drug. The answer is emphatically no. Addiction research simply does not support the theory that marijuana is a gateway drug. And a gateway drug is one whose use results in increased likelihood of using more serious drugs like cocaine or heroin. Research shows that marijuana could more accurately be described as a terminus drug because the vast majority of people who use marijuana do not go on to use other drugs. In fact, there's growing evidence that recreational marijuana might help address the opioid epidemic. In today's Boston Globe, there were 2 studies cited from the Journal of the American Medical Association that showed a large decline in opioid prescriptions in states that have legalized marijuana. And another study in Colorado has showed that since cannabis has been legal in Colorado, there's been a reduction in opioid-related deaths. Another important issue, particularly for our kids, is inadvertent access or dosing issues with edibles. Colorado has dealt with this through issuing very strong regulations that require infused edibles to comply with packaging, labeling, and potency restrictions, tamper-proof packages, blister packs, individual wrapper requirements, and severe limits on potency. In addition, the word candy is not allowed anywhere near edible packaging, and manufacturing edibles in shapes that are appealing to kids, such as gummy bears, have been strictly banned. The state of Washington has done the exact same thing, and in Monday again in the Boston Globe, there was an article that described the Massachusetts Cannabis Commission moving in that direction. So what do we know about the impact of increased marijuana availability on public safety? There are several studies that examine this issue. The most recent study concluded that 3 years after recreational marijuana legalization, changes in motor vehicle crash fatality rates in Washington and Colorado were not different from those in similar states without recreational marijuana legalization. Crash fatality rates weren't any different. Of course, after July, adults in Massachusetts will be able to legally purchase and use recreational marijuana, whether they buy it here in Rockport, or whether they buy it in Gloucester, or whether they buy it in communities where they live. Some will probably be foolish enough to drive impaired, and our police will need to address this issue. The same way our police addressed the issue around driving under the influence of alcohol, even though there are no package stores here in Rockport. So what's my bottom line? Based on the facts, citing a medical marijuana dispensary or a recreational pot shop in town won't have the harmful consequences that many fear. There won't be a dramatic increase in youth access. There won't be an opioid epidemic. In fact, just the opposite, perhaps. And there will be an impact on traffic safety, which will happen whether or not there's a pot shop here. Finally, my sincere hope is that this discussion tonight and the conversation that we have at town meeting and the election will be a springboard for us to focus on longer-term substance abuse issues. We really need to expand the conversation with our kids about their risk behaviors, about drugs and about other risk behaviors. We need to be having these honest conversations with them. And we need to better recognize the signs of substance abuse in our friends and in our relatives. We need to educate, we need to prevent, and we need to intervene. Those will have a lasting impact on the health and well-being of our community in Rockport. Thanks.
Thank you. 7 minutes and 15 seconds. I know our next speaker pretty well. Wanda Visnick has been a registered nurse for about 28 years, and she spent many of those years here in Rockport, working first at Denmark and then in the Rockport school systems as the school nurse leader. And she is now studying at Northeastern University to become a nurse practitioner. She's going to talk to us about what is marijuana, the chemistry, the effects, long-range use, safety, delivery methods, and storage. Wanda?
Thank you. I'm hoping my voice projects without the microphone. Is everyone good? Okay. So what is our responsibility as a community looking at this vote? And I would say our first responsibility is to understand what a recreational establishment is. And I think Herm did that well, but that's from the growing, processing, as well as the selling in retail. So we could be looking at greenhouses, farms, as well as stores. So we need to educate ourselves. We need to educate our community, and that's our children, our elders, pregnant women, people who are at high risk for using cannabis products legally, illegally, and medically. So we need to do some education. The glitch in this is that neither our public health department in Massachusetts or the research has caught up with this policy and social norm of implementing retail shops in our communities. So we're left to look for this information on our own. And if you did any research for tonight, you'll find that you probably got information overload and lots of conflicting information. And that's because cannabis is so complicated. And the reason it is so complicated is that there are 3 different strains, and they have been cultivated, and you can see a little chart down here, they've been cultivated for different strengths, for different effects. So we're not talking about one plant and smoking one joint. We're talking about a combination of over 500 phytochemicals, 104 cannabinoids, and only 2 of them have been cited in research that I could find. There's a few more, but they were minor, and I didn't embrace them for tonight's talk. So we have a little bit of research, and incomplete and incomprehensive research at this point. You heard some from Sadie, you heard some from Bruce, and they seem to conflict each other. And if you're doing research on cannabis and cannabis effects, you will hear that some research says it has all these benefits, and other research will say there's all these risks. What we have to keep in mind is the legal use of a mature adult using responsibly versus the illegal use and access of our adolescents and young adults. So just quickly to go over the different strengths, at Woodstock what they tested was 1% THC, and you can read that for yourself. We are now, what is being confiscated in some of the communities are up to 32% THC. The most common that the kids have access to is about 15 to 20% right now. And I have to do a disclaimer. My hope was to be very objective in my presentation with factual information, but my passion is the health and well-being of youth and emerging adults up until about 25 when their brain is fully developed. So my little disclaimer is I am a little bit biased, but I'm trying to give you just factual information that I could find based on research. Sadie talked a little bit about the cannabinoid receptors in our body. The human endocannabinoid system is sort of, they just started discovering this back in 1992, and then there was a ban on the research. So that's why it's a little inconclusive. It's really difficult to study the effects of cannabis because it's a class 1 substance, which is indicated by the DEA as highly addictive. And so there's only a few growers that the government will allow researchers to use to get the research done. And there are many different agencies that researchers, valid researchers, have to go through, and many loopholes they have to go through to get research studies done. And that's why it's so hard. That's why we really don't have as much information as we should at this point in time. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we did just start in 1990 researching the brain. So as Sadie pointed out, we have a lot of information about the different receptors and the molecular and neurobiology now, but we don't really have a full understanding of its interrelationship with lots of substances, food, pollution, our environment, stress, and alcohol, marijuana, and other substances. So this is just a growing science right now. Let's see. I did just want to mention that there is Marinol and Sesamate that is available at the drugstore. It is prescription cannabis. You can go to Rite Aid and get it with the prescription if your doctor prescribes it for you. So we do have access to medicinal marijuana in this form. The other form that medicinal marijuana takes is through a physician who's been trained to prescribe it, and they can give you up to 10 ounces for a 60-day supply. The closest place to get that right now is in Salem. And then you would go to your pot tender and ask what you should get. What do I get now for my 10 ounces? So this is the inside of a retail shop that I thought was very well done. It was in Colorado. And I went into it because I was traveling there, and they allowed me to take pictures. So you go into your pot tender and you say, what do I get? Tell me about what you have here. And so they allow for medicinal use or recreational use. But what we need to consider as a host community is the illegal use and access that may occur, and the perception of our community and the perception of having legalized cannabis and marijuana in our community, what that perception of harm is to our young people as they walk through Bearskin Neck or ride their bikes. So I just want to go through quickly the different ways that you can use cannabis, and I will not win the prize for being the fastest person, but I'm going to go through this quick. So in the store, they will have everything you need to consume cannabis. You can have rolling papers, and they will have buds. And in these jars here, I don't know if I can put, in these jars, they're actually based on these different combinations. So you will say, what effect do you want? I'd like to be calm, I'd like to be energetic, I'd like to go to sleep, I'd like to feel euphoric, and they will set you up with what you are requesting. Also, they will have the supplies. If you don't want to smoke that, you can use a bong, and it usually filters it through water. And there's all kinds of shapes and sizes of bongs. You can pick what you like. What's most common now is vaping. We are struggling with this in our public schools in a big way, both in middle schools and high schools. And you can vape just flavors. You can vape nicotine anywhere from 3 to 30 milligrams, and you can vape THC. And the issue with vaping is when the kids are vaping, we don't know what they're vaping. Half the time they don't know what they're vaping. But vaping is another method for consuming cannabis. The peak onset, the onset of action is about 10 minutes, similar to smoking. It bypasses the gut, so it goes right from the lungs into the bloodstream. It lasts for about 2 hours, and that's these are just some more vaping supplies that may be available. Dabbing is something that's done recreationally for a good, solid high. And this is something that a lot of young adults, legal young adults, are using. And it's a high concentration, so it's 80% THC. And there's a whole form that they go through to melt it down into this honey. These are the words for it: wax, dab, shutter, butter. And this is very highly psychoactive. And this is really where we're seeing a lot of the reactions for psychosis and anxiety. So then we get into edibles. These are known as the longer and stronger. They take longer to digest here. And what happens when they get into your gut is the THC conforms to a more toxic, a more potent THC. The onset for each
8 minutes, honey.
could be, sorry, that threw me off. So you get that in your gut, and the problem with the edibles, this is where a lot of the poisonings are happening in young kids or pets, or even people who are not used to using. One of these servings could be up to, there's some more edibles. So a safe way to start using is, I'm going to just go back to the slide, because I jumped ahead in my brain. So a safe dose of THC, so these are some of the products with the different milligrams that they have. And Colorado's done a really good job in educating their tourists and their public. Massachusetts is definitely lagging behind in this. But they say start slow, low, and infrequent. So if you're going to be a person who wants to experiment with marijuana, you want to start with 2.5 milligrams. So if we look at some of these things,
9 minutes.
I just want to go buy a chocolate bar, right? And the starting dose is 2.5 milligrams, and I go and eat a chocolate bar, I'm going to have respiratory depression and end up in the emergency room. So it's really important to find, I'm taking some of Sadie's pen. So it's really important to know what you're buying and what the content is, and if you are a responsible adult using some of these products, to keep them safely locked away from young children and pets. That's the message we need to drive home with safe storage. I also wanted to let you know that in these stores, they do have other types of administration. You can use suppositories for intravaginal or rectal administration. That onset is about 15 minutes, and it lasts about 2 hours. And sublingually is almost immediate, and that can last for, I think that's 1 hour. All right.
Mary Beth says I need to give you some extra time if I know what's good for me.
So just to reinforce what Sadie talked about, this is a functional MRI, and the top row is someone who is not using marijuana, and they are engaging in a specific task. And then the bottom row there is a person who is currently, during that functional MRI, under the influence of cannabis and doing the same exact test. So that, you can just see that prefrontal cortex there that we were talking about, the brain matures from posterior to anterior, and we see a little bit more electrical activity here and there. Now, there's other research that will say, well, what if that person is predisposed to this? Or what if you're already predisposed to some of the side effects, like anxiety or depression? And I think that what we need to understand is the research is inconclusive. You can find research to support any angle if you look hard enough. And it's just looking at data over time. So I'm not going to go through this because we touched upon most of this. I do want to just talk briefly about adult anxiety and depression, because that has come up a lot in the news about, if you smoke marijuana, it can cause more anxiety and depression. And that really lends itself to the conversation about that dopamine pathway. So as dopamine is, as pathways are being formed in your brain, it's like a dirt road. And we're always looking for pleasure, right, in our adolescence and even as we grow. So we can have pleasure from many different things: laughter, exercise, sex, good food. So that's what we want to teach our people, our young people, our children, and mostly our emerging adults. So you can use marijuana legally at the age of 21, but your brain does not stop growing, or that prefrontal cortex doesn't fully form for emotional stability until age 25. So this is just a quick slide about the research cycle and why it is so complicated. There's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles at the government, the federal government level, which does not afford us the opportunity to do the research. We are making policy decisions based on social norms, and we definitely need more research. That's just a little history there. What we do know, this is a literature review from the New England Journal of Medicine, and they talked about the confidence of the evidence for certain effects of marijuana when they did their literature review. So I'm just going to go through the high ones. The addiction to marijuana and other substances. The confidence level in the evidence is high. Diminished lifetime achievement. The confidence in the research is high. Motor vehicle accidents, high. Symptoms of chronic bronchitis, high. Well, there's some others there. But this was the New England Journal of Medicine doing a full literature review on the different studies that have been done. Sadie did a fabulous job of highlighting my passion, which is the legal use of our youth. And I'll just go over the statistics very quickly. I have access to a lot of data. I'm also working at the Department of Public Health as the expert coordinator in schools, and that's the substance use screening tool that's now mandated across the Commonwealth. So I have access to a lot of data as well. So she cited some of the very same studies I looked at. 25 to 50% with daily use will become addicted. That has been well supported in several studies. 9% of youth who experiment will become addicted. I found that in studies both in 2009 and 2014. The two pieces of information I want you to walk away with is 15% of 10th graders in Massachusetts use marijuana or other substances. 15% of our 10th graders. Just throwing that out there. And one of the effects on public health for communities who did open retail shops was that they had a 30% increase of phone calls to poison control for marijuana poisoning. And they also had an increase in toddler and pet poisoning in their emergency rooms. So there is emergency room data that supports that. This right here is what we need to really think about as a community and a responsible host. If you look at this, this is marijuana use. Whoops. If you looked at that, it was marijuana use that's going up and the perception of harm going down. So this is the perceived risk from using marijuana. It's going down. So we need to think about what Herm said and where our pot shop will be in Rockport, and likely it will be in Bearskin Neck. This is where my biasness comes out. If it is an adult retail shop, it should be someplace where adults can drive. The Bearskin Neck is where we send our children on half days to go with their friends, to have freedom on their bikes, and I just don't think that in this community it's the best place for it. And I'd love for you all to go to town meeting and vote
so that it can get on the ballot, so we can have some more time to talk about where this should be located in our community and how we can be responsible hosts for both legal use and illegal use. And I thank you all for my extra time.
What choice did I have? All right, our next speaker is the Chief of Police, John Horvath, who will talk to us about risks and safety implications.
Move over, Mr. Disney.
Yes, sir.
Taking the podium. Come over here. You can sit over right here.
No.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Horvath, and I'm the Chief of Police for the Rockport Police Department in our town. I feel more comfortable and respectful stepping forward to address you from the podium. That's why I did so. How about this? Better? Okay. I stepped forward because it's a little bit more comfortable for me, and I believe it's a little bit more respectful to address you from the podium. That's why I did so. I've got a limited amount of time, so I've prepared some comments because I want to ensure that you get my complete message conveyed, because this is a very, very important topic that potentially will have an impact on our community forever. Let me be clear, from a public safety standpoint, I am absolutely opposed to a marijuana recreational pot shop in our town. The impacts of safety to our community and the quality of life in Rockport associated with an increase in marijuana use and related activity concerns me as a police officer as well as a community member and father. Rockport will become a destination for people not only to purchase marijuana, but also consume it within the confines of our town. It will likely be done in a public place, even though illegal, and therefore negatively impacting those people around them during such use. A likely scenario is the individuals will purchase marijuana and go to a part of town that we're all familiar with, whether it's Bearskin Neck, Front Beach, Long Beach, Halibut State Park, one of the many quarries in town, or maybe in front of your home. How will the behavior of the individuals high on marijuana, which is an intoxicating drug, affect you? Let's briefly look at 3 areas that I believe are very important and should be in the forefront of our minds. Number 1 is safety, number 2 is quality of life, and number 3 is potential revenue. I hope that we all agree that the safety and well-being of everyone in our community comes first. So with that being said, let me present you with the following question. How does allowing recreational marijuana increase the safety in this community? The answer is, it does not improve the safety of our community. Rather, marijuana sales can only have a negative impact on safety for obvious reasons that marijuana is an intoxicating drug which results in the user's altered state of consciousness and other negative effects that don't lend themselves to their personal safety or the safety of others around them. Similar to alcohol, marijuana sales by law are limited to individuals 21 years and older. Does anyone believe that individuals won't walk into a pot shop and purchase marijuana for their friends who are under 21? Marijuana sales in town make it easier and more convenient to obtain the drug and, in essence, encourage people to use it locally. The convenience of marijuana sales in town will absolutely negatively affect the youth in this community and their safety. An increase in operating under the influence and impaired driving incidents can be expected with a pot shop in town. Does an increase in OUI in a town like Rockport with narrow, congested streets, high volumes of pedestrian and vehicular traffic, as well as bicyclists, lend itself to a safe environment? The answer is no. Further complicating the issue and increasing the risk to members of this community is the absence of any accepted standard field sobriety test that police officers can use to determine if someone is operating while high. With a pot shop in Rockport, these concerns extend to the waters surrounding our town and the need for an increased enforcement on the water, which means more resources and more money, which I will discuss in a bit. The second question we must ask ourselves is, how does allowing recreational marijuana sales in town improve the quality of life in our community? Surprisingly, the answer is does nothing for the quality of life in our community. I argue that the negative impacts that most people may not have considered far outweigh any positive impacts for a pot shop in Rockport. For example, rowdy, boisterous, disruptive behavior and more noise complaints. Unsightly activity and behaviors associated with people that are high, being unsteady on their feet, alarming and unexpected mannerisms, as well as potential violent outbursts. Something as small as littering can be associated with the use of marijuana. Individuals that smoke marijuana don't always smoke them in rolling papers. Many of them empty out cigars and they dump tobacco on the ground and smoke the marijuana inside a cigar wrapper. Small things like that in our town will make a big difference. Let's remember, this is the town where the police department receives complaints for dogs chasing waves and people fishing on the rocks. I am sure that some of you may be familiar with the foul smell of marijuana. For those who are not, there is a skunky, pungent odor associated with the drug that can be offensive. Do you or your family want to be exposed to that smell while you sit down at a restaurant in town or maybe take in a show? Is it realistic that someone will walk into a pot shop in downtown Rockport, purchase their marijuana, and then go to the end of Bearskin Neck or sit on Front Beach and smoke it? I believe so. And under that scenario, what happens when that person or group begins to smoke that marijuana next to a family of 4, including 2 young children? Do you think that family will look at the town of Rockport in the same way? Will they make this town their vacation destination the following year? Do we stand to lose valuable revenue from visitors to town due to the negative experiences they have had with individuals high on marijuana? These are tough questions that need to be considered when we think about the financial aspect of the decision to allow recreational marijuana in Rockport, which leads me to the last area I want to touch on, which is money. How does allowing recreational marijuana sales in Rockport financially benefit us as taxpayers? I will allow Dr. Wedmore to address the financial aspect, but before I do that, I want to leave you with a couple final thoughts. As an economic strategy, wouldn't the town of Rockport be better situated to attract viable tourists, including young families and the elderly, to our community, as opposed to those communities who have decided to offer recreational marijuana and incur the associated problems? Shouldn't we be attracting people who enhance rather than potentially degrade the Rockport experience? And lastly, as taxpayers, do you want your police officers spending their patrol time, and it is a significant amount of patrol time, dealing with motor vehicle crashes, OUI investigations, and other marijuana-related calls for service such as disorderly conduct, rather than focusing on the real needs of our community, such as emergency response to medical calls and order maintenance tasks such as parking and traffic control? With 2 officers on patrol, allowing a pot shop in Rockport can be expected to significantly increase calls for service and take away from many of the other duties and responsibilities your police officers should be attending to. Is the town prepared to fund an increase in the number of police officers to address an increase in calls for service related to marijuana, in the hopes of maintaining the town's current level of safety and quality of life? Lastly, what price is anyone here willing to put on a human life connected to a marijuana-related accident or other tragedy? The negative impacts associated with opening a recreational marijuana shop in Rockport are numerous and demand careful consideration for the well-being of our community. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I will pass the microphone to Dr. Wedmore.
Thank you, Chief. Well, as a society, one of the things that we finally figured out is we can't incarcerate and arrest our way free of drug dependence and drug abuse. So we ended up passing a referendum legalizing marijuana. But it does not follow that in doing that, we also wish to embrace the champion to facilitate drug use, marijuana use. Indeed, to date, in Massachusetts, about 169 towns have already implemented either an outright ban or a moratorium on the use of marijuana. So what's in it for the town if we do have marijuana? Well, the state's dangled out a 3% tax that will go to the town on the sale of marijuana. Assuming there's a marijuana shop and it sells $1 million worth of product, that's 3% of $1 million, that's $30,000. A couple of bucks there. But who's going to have their hand out for that? Well, the chief has already got his there. Simple things like driving. Not only driving, my driving. Now, my wife is always complaining about my driving, and that's because she makes a distinction between the sidewalk and the road, and I'm a little less precise about it. But we both agree that if I start smoking that, or even downwind from it, I'm probably going to be spending a lot of time, and the chief is going to be spending a lot of time on overtime counseling me on my driving. And then the schools. Now, the school budget is the biggest use of funds in town, and well, it should be. But the problem is, as some kids may get into marijuana, as they are now, but have adverse effects from anything from attention deficit or attention diminution to panic attacks to the rare psychotic episode, those all end up in special education treatment. And our special education is one of those things funded, not funded, one of those things mandated by the state and funded by the town through taxes. Right now, special education is about near $5 million, 34% of the budget, and it's going up 6% this next year. So where's that 30,000 give us? Chief's already got his hand out for half of it. School's got his hand out for more than that. So the town ends up with very little left over. That's like buying retail and selling wholesale. Money changes hands, but it's not going in the right direction. So if we don't host marijuana shops here, how do we square the circle with a realistic argument that you're still going to have problems with people having the effect of marijuana, which they bought elsewhere, potentially using it in the town, and having to spend town expenses on monitoring, policing, and sorting that out? Well, we learned one thing from the tobacco industry, at least. If you have an activity in a behavior and you wish to lessen it, the way you do it, and it took us damn well near 50 years, is you make it less readily available, you make it inconvenient to use, and you apply negative social context to it, and you tax it. It's kind of like, we don't spit on the sidewalk much now because of social context, just like you don't put ketchup on your waffles when you go to the Brothers Brew because of social pressure. Again, it comes down to there's ways of lessening the impact by setting higher standards, passing them on to your kids, and letting people know about it. The result of which is that we can live without the 3% tax and have more return from better style of living and less adverse effects. So yes, we wanted to legalize marijuana because just like prohibition, it made no sense and it was a fool's errand. But no, we don't want to champion marijuana and make it available for everybody, especially make it more readily accessible for kids. And we can do better financially and socially by passing up the 3% and having a better place to live in. Thank you.
Thank you. Now is the time that I envision the open discussion, and it can be a free-for-all. If you want to ask a question, and before everyone asks a question, but if you want to ask a question and you're a little shy. If you raise your hand now, we'll make sure you get a card so you can write down your question. Mary Ann? All right. We'll have some cards for you in a second. And also, why don't you come down front and then we can have a little bit less formal discussion. When you ask the question, let us know if you want to address it to a particular individual or if it's just an open question for the group. So we'll take questions. We'll go here from right to left. And Dr. Lisi. We may be able to get that slide, but at least we can ask Herm to discuss it. May take a little while, so we'll take some other questions and we'll come back to that. Mary.
What is the state law now about an individual growing marijuana in their own backyard themselves?
So an individual can have 6 marijuana plants growing at their primary residence, but they need to be out of the public view with an unassisted eye. So in other words, if they're growing it in the backyard, there has to be a fence. It can't be seen from the neighbor's house, even from the second floor. 6 plants per person or 12 plants per household. Where do you live?
Very appropriately on High Street.
Easy, Bob. Easy.
Is there a total number of establishments of any type that can be in Rockport if this was approved?
And I believe that might be to Herm or to the chief.
The ratio that is...
I can't hear you. Thank you.
The ratio is a 5-to-1 ratio. So for every 5 licenses, alcohol licenses you have in town, then you can have 1 pot shop.
And how many alcohol licenses do we have?
Well, currently we only have 1 which is unused. It's associated with a food store that has yet to be. There is a, what can I say? There is an individual who has proposed that we provide another 3 licenses, make them available for someone who would be interested in opening a package store. However, that is a proposal that comes up at town meeting. It is less than 5. The question then becomes, what would the state say if someone came along and said, well, I'd still like to have a pot shop. 4 is close enough to 5. Can I not have one? And we don't really know what the state would in fact do, how they would react.
So we would not have control of that, the state?
I don't think we would.
If I may editorialize on that, these regulations have more or less just come out, and they're subject to all sorts of change and interpretation. And the regulation actually talks about sort of package store licenses issued. And of course, we have no package store licenses issued. And whether that means automatically 0 or something more than 0, town council's trying to get the answers to those questions, and they may not have precise answers yet. That's why courts exist and lawyers send their kids to college. Yes, sir.
Mr. Delaney, I don't have any hard statistics on, you know, hardened criminals with respect to marijuana. One thing I have read, and you know, Dr. Cohen talked about statistics, so we can have statistics to support his side of the argument. I can dig up statistics to support my side of the argument. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. What I can tell you is a lot of what I have read is there is still a black market out there for marijuana. Just because it's been legalized, people still don't want to pay taxes, I guess, so they're buying it illegally. Legalization has already occurred. We've resigned ourselves to that fact. We've trained our officers and we'll continue to train our officers to ensure that we're providing the proper service with regards to marijuana being legal. What we're against is making it more convenient and bringing it here to our town, which is going to significantly increase not only potential crime, but all the safety and quality of life issues that I mentioned earlier. And many times, those quality of life issues are more important to people than actually criminal activity, because I've got a fair amount of experience working in the city and in a short time working at a university. And resounding complaints I received weren't about serious crime happening in the city in the middle of the night because most people are home sleeping. It was a quality of life type of incidents occurring when people were awake and out and about. And those were the things that I heard most at community meetings. So to answer your question, I don't have any hard and fast statistics on it, particularly not in Rockport. It's too early for that. But this, allowing a recreational marijuana shop in Rockport, is going to have a significant negative impact on this community. I'm on record saying it now. So if it gets approved and we get there, I want you to remember that I said it, because I firmly believe that. I have experience elsewhere. I haven't researched it or read about things. I've actually lived it, and I've seen what happens when you have marijuana in communities and it affects the young and the old.
Before we go on to the next question, I think Dr. Lisi had a question, and Herm, why don't you grab the microphone from the chief and...
So you should look at this table as three possibilities. So on the far left-hand side, disapproval. That's disapproval of the ban at town meeting. No issue would result from that to be placed on the May 15th ballot, and recreational sales would in fact occur in Rockport if somebody comes forth and asks to set up a shop potentially. The middle is another possibility. Approval at town meeting would put the issue on the May 15th ballot. Then, if there was disapproval on May 15, again, recreational sales in Rockport would be supported. The third possibility is approval at town meeting, issue on the ballot, approval on the ballot, recreational sales in Rockport would be defeated. Does that clarify it?
And an additional question?
Sure.
You mentioned something about a 2/3 vote, I believe.
Yes. It was mentioned somewhere. It's a 2/3 vote because it's a zoning issue. It came up under zoning. It didn't come up. It didn't come up as a general bylaw. It came up as a zoning bylaw. Consequently, it's 2/3 as opposed to 51%. This is unfortunate, but that's the way it is because the issue became a zoning board issue and not an issue that the Board of Selectmen wanted to deal with.
But once it's on a ballot, I believe it's just a majority.
Yeah, if it does get on the ballot May 15th, then it is a 51% issue, yes.
I think that's the confusion. It says article to establish a ban, and to disapprove it, you've got to get 2/3 of the people to vote yes or no.
Can I take a crack at this one?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So we have a lot of different things at play. The first is the tenor of the vote in 2016, which was more or less that these things are going to be approved except where communities affirmatively disapprove them. And there are lots of different ways that, or there are several different ways that this could have been banned. The way Rockport is doing it at this town meeting is through a zoning bylaw The first one, Article P, would say essentially that recreational marijuana establishments are not permitted in any of the 7 zoning districts. And since that's coming up through a change in our zoning bylaws, all of those require a 2/3 vote. Now, that's for the vote at town meeting. If 2/3 of the people vote, yes, we want a ban, since Rockport was one of the communities in the Commonwealth that voted for recreational marijuana, that means it has to go to the people in a ballot, which will be on May 15th. So it's a 2-part process. And Rockport almost mirrored identically the state percentage for recreational marijuana, which was about 53.6, 53.8%. Is that about right for that one? Okay. I have a question now that's going to require my reading glasses because it's a written question, and it reads as follows. Pot shops will be licensed, but will customers be required to pass a test and pay for a license that certifies them as responsible adults who intend to engage in a potentially harmful practice? Automobile drivers are required to do so and pay for a license. I think I know the answer to that, but I'm going to pass that one on to the chief.
I have to say no. There is no test for people seeking to purchase marijuana, recreational
That would eliminate many of us from many activities, I believe. Let's take another hand-raising question in the back. Don.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to everybody here tonight for coming and informing everybody. It's an important topic that's going to affect us potentially for years to come. I agree with the chief. I think the chief has it spot on his analysis of what could potentially happen. But I think we're looking at a couple of different things here. One is about the image and the message that we want to send as a town to people who come to visit this town. You know, I don't think it sends the right message to do it. My opinion is what somebody does in the sanctity of their own home is their business. They can do what they want. I'm not anti-marijuana, I'm just anti-public marijuana. And I don't think it's the right message to send it there. Gloucester has taken this up, and Gloucester now has as provision for a dispensary in a section of town that's away from everything. They're geared to it. Anything that we would have would be in the forefront of what we have as a town for our resource. So I don't think it's the right place to have it. Mrs. Bisley said that, you know, you could find statistics to support either side, and she's absolutely right. You could swing at that cat and find statistics anywhere you want them to support anything you want to say. So as far as what it does to kids, I agree with what Dr. Jimenez said. I think it does have some negative implications and what others have said. However, I think people are going to vote whether they like it or they don't. And I think that's really what it comes down to. With respect to the tax side of it, the 3% tax for me is a non-issue. You know, if we do have, on Dr. Wetmore's numbers of $1 million, let's just say that that's correct. $30,000, we can find that money somewhere else. We don't need to come to the plot. That's not something that comes here. And lastly, what I'll say is to Mr. Lilia, I hope that a clear explanation can be given at town meeting, because I feel like with 4 questions on the ballot, this is going to cause more confusion than it's going to clarify. And I think people are going to be very confused about what they vote on, how they vote on it, and how they interact with each individual question. So I hope that gets addressed in a much more clear fashion. Thank you very much to everybody again.
Is there a question, Don?
There wasn't. There was a statement.
Okay. All right. So I have another shy person question. What is the process that a police officer used to determine whether someone is driving high, and how many police in town will be able to determine an OUI?
Okay, so currently all our officers are basically trained at the basic level for a standard field sobriety testing, which is used for alcohol. There is no certified, accepted, standard anywhere in the country for testing individuals under the influence of marijuana and operating a vehicle of marijuana. We have what's called drug recognition experts that are trained at a higher level. No officer in Rockport is currently a drug recognition expert. In the late fall of 2016, one of our supervisors on the midnight shift made an arrest for OUI drugs. The operator was determined by the supervisor on scene based on his training and experience, marijuana being present in the car, a strong odor of marijuana smelled from 1 or 2 car lengths away, if you can imagine. Made the arrest, brought in a drug recognition expert from Ipswich who came in at probably 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to assist our agency. The case went to trial, and approximately 2 months ago, the individual was found not guilty in the Gloucester District Court because the officer that's a drug recognition expert was not determined to be an expert. So that makes you wonder, why train the officers at a higher level if they're not recognized as experts in court? So this is very problematic, not just for our department, but across the entire Commonwealth and across the entire United States. There is no accepted practice because the difference for blood alcohol content versus THC levels, and the fact that THC levels doesn't necessarily mean that the person is too high to drive. There's a lot of moving parts here. So it's, for us, it's very problematic. Number one, it's very labor intensive. I'm not sure what folks think the amount of time it takes to do a OUI and operating under the influence for alcohol, just for straight alcohol, which all our officers are trained to do. It takes 3 to 4 hours from the time they pull that car over to the time they complete the booking process. So our officers work an 8-hour shift. We have 2 officers on the road, and we're taking one of them off the road for 3 to 4 hours. So now, if we have another call for service in town that requires 2 officers, it could be a medical call, it could be a domestic dispute, it could be an accident, a motor vehicle accident. We are automatically in a situation where we're calling for mutual aid to the city of Gloucester to help police our community, because one of our officers is tied up for 3 to 4 hours. That's for OUI alcohol. When you have to bring in a drug recognition expert from another town, if they're available, it's probably 4 to 6 hours for that investigation, which is almost an entire shift. Is that how we want our officers spending their time in our community?
Yes.
I want to actually ask some follow-up questions about that. So question number one is...
Here, why don't you come over here?
Question number one is, are you planning on training any officers in Rockport to become drug recognition officers? Question number one. Question number two, how much does it cost? And then question number three is, will you do this regardless of whether there's a ban in Rockport or not?
So yes, we plan to train officers. There's the drug recognition expert standard, which is the highest. There's a half measure, which is 16 hours of training. The drug recognition expert training is 80 hours of training and an additional level of training where they have to actually go and do site evaluations of people under the influence. There's a half measure that's 16 hours of training that I'm seeking to get everybody in our department certified in that level. I'm really looking to see what other municipalities are doing, because we have a local example of utilizing a drug recognition expert in our community for an extremely solid case, taken all the way to trial, and it was a not guilty verdict. So are we really going to spend the time and resources that go along with it to have something that goes to court, and in essence, there's no accountability for that offender? The training itself for drug recognition expert is free. What's not free is filling that officer's shift while he's at training. And if we were to send an officer to training, we calculated it'd be between $4,000 and $5,000 to train one officer as a drug recognition expert. If we get all of our officers the 16 hours of training, we're looking at more in the area of $7,000 to $8,000 to get them all trained in that 16 hours.
Chief, I think you may have answered part of this, but here we go. If someone is high and gets pulled over, how will it be determined that he or she was under the influence at that time? Doesn't, and I believe they mean THC, stay in the system a long time?
Yes, as I stated earlier, because marijuana is so unique with respect to THC levels that's stored in the fatty tissue of the body, and I'm not a doctor, but I know much, based on my research, alcohol is water soluble, THC is stored in the fatty cells, which means it can remain in your system for a long period of time. If you're a heavy marijuana user, you can have THC in your system from 2 or 3 days ago and would come up testing positive and not necessarily be negatively affecting your ability to drive a vehicle. That's the challenge police departments across this country are facing. There is no standardized test for officers to use to determine whether or not people are under the influence of marijuana while they're operating a vehicle. And there's significant data out there to support that there are an increase in crashes depending on which study you read. If you read a recent article put out by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the crashes in Colorado have significantly increased. The fatalities have significantly increased from 2013 to 2016. But I guess it's all which study you read.
It's 8:30. Will the panelists stay for a few extra minutes if there are a few more questions? Sure. A unanimous yes. Questions?
Correct, but you need consent, number one, or you need a court order in order to do that. So your run-of-the-mill motor vehicle stop, individual pulled over, you suspected, you're operating under the influence, they're going to have to give you consent to take their blood, or you need a court order to get that blood. So that's not a run-of-the-mill investigation that a patrol officer is going to get involved in with respect to getting somebody's blood to determine their THC level. And once again, I would defer to a doctor on the panel. I'm not even sure that by the time that blood is taken, that THC level is the same as it was when they were operating the vehicle. So I don't even know if that would pass the sniff test, if you will, once it made it to court. I think a lot of these things have not been adjudicated yet, and that's why we're on very uncertain ground, which makes all of this, in my mind at this point, very untenable for us as a community to say we want this here without it being more well thought out and researched.
So, Alan, I have a little bit of an after word on that. As a former military attorney, we used to do a lot of courts-martial based on use of marijuana, and through urinalysis, and I think we would use gas chromatography and mass spectroscopy. And there was a nanogram level below which could be innocent ingestion. And it was a fairly it was a fairly robust standard, and so that would do away with the defense that our sailors used to say, that they went to a concert and they just were passively inhaling the substance, because you wouldn't get to a positive result until the nanograms were above a certain level. I don't know if that's how Massachusetts would do it or not. Questions? Yes, sir. He doesn't have to answer that. He will be.
Sure.
There are limitations in the length of presentations, but everybody who wants to make a presentation will likely have the opportunity to do that. Yes, in the back.
Well, the given relationship is 5 to 1. All right, whether or not that's absolute,
remains to be seen. But that's the stated relationship between the two. For every 5, you can have 1.
If we do not have 5, or whatever the number is, that means that a pot shop cannot be open until there are 4 or 5.
That's also a question, as has been suggested. We don't know what the courts will ultimately say. But there is this ratio. Will it be achieved if it's 4 to 1 instead of 5 to 1? We don't know the answer. But that's the way we at least are thinking it will follow.
And the liquor license, if that came up at town meeting, sorry, I don't know that.
Yeah, and then there's the question as to whether or not it has to be an active license or just a license available. That I understood recently from someone who I took the word at it here in the town administration, that it was actually just the license itself. It did not have to be in place. But Bob is suggesting maybe that's not clear either. But town council will be here at the time of the meeting. Hopefully town council will have a clear answer.
The regulations seem to contemplate larger communities when they're talking about the 5 to 1 ratio. And the regulation says licenses issued. Now, how that's interpreted, licenses issued or issuable, it remains to be seen. We'll go in the back and then we'll move forward. Yes? Pizza. No. Sir.
So theoretically, if the town only has 3 liquor licenses, this whole issue is moot?
No. No, there are regulations that I would argue are somewhat vague that gives discretion in, for example, the Board of Selectmen in allowing number of licenses. That is somewhat of a different issue than whether they're banned in all zoning districts. So if they're not banned, then the Board of Selectmen will have regulations that they can use in determining how they are going to grant licenses and how that's going to work. Hasn't been done yet in the Commonwealth, so.
May I comment?
Sure.
And the issue of licenses, as far as I know, is a state issue. We have the right to dictate how the shops operate in the town, but we do not have a license that we offer. They get a license from the state. So the state determines that the prospect is believable and is not likely to be a problem to the licensing commission, the CCC, and the control commission. Then they will, I dare say, give the license. Then it's a matter of that individual, that group coming to the town and establishing a relationship with the town with the hearings about that. And not only would there be a permit issued by the planning board the way the bylaws and terms and stuff, but there would also be this other issue of the applicant coming before the town so that there is a thorough understanding of who that party is and what they're about.
Yes, ma'am.
So the control has expressed in 2 of the articles, that's RMS, which I didn't lay out for you because we didn't have time. But we have decided that the hours of the stores will have operation on Monday to Friday, 10 to 6, Sunday 12 to 6. They're supposed to have security, 24-hour security. Any break-in is supposed to be immediately reported to the police department. That's really intense. Well, sign's an issue. Colorado says there cannot be any indication as to the nature of the product on the sign or anything about the building where it is sold. Massachusetts law was designed after Colorado law with regard to this. However, the question is whether or not that will stand up. So you can't say very much. You can have a name for it, but it will have to come out or not, because what was that?
Tom.
In respect to that particular case, I don't have any information as to whether or not there were any further steps taken with regards to that. There's the penalties for operating under the influence of drugs and alcohol, for that matter, can be a fine, could be a combination of a fine and a prison sentence. And then the first two offenses are misdemeanors, and then everything after that are felonies. But with respect to that particular case, I don't know if the court fined the individual or not. The takeaway from that is a person's been designated as a drug recognition expert, and the court told us that they didn't recognize that person as an expert. So where does that leave us moving forward? That's the concern.
Sir.
You've mentioned a number of different possible ill results from having hot shots in Rockport. I'm not clear on which of them is more deleterious to the community. In particular, the effect on children or teenagers who or the driving under the influence. Which one is more dangerous to the community?
I'll give my 2 cents. I think both of those are equally dangerous, depending on the circumstances. Sure, those two that you mentioned, but I think it's really left up to the individual, whether it's someone driving under the influence that doesn't hit anybody and just gets arrested for that, or it's somebody who has people smoking marijuana in a car in front of their house and they're making all kinds of noise and they're rowdy, and that's impacting them, and that's very personal to them. So I think that question is really a personal question, and it strikes people at different levels.
Anyone else? If anyone wants to have some informal discussions, the panelists will be here for a couple minutes, some of them. Others have to run to other events, but thank you all for braving the weather tonight. I have the regulations on my phone. I can barely read them, but if anybody wants to come up and take a look at them, and if you Google Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, you'll find all the regulations and the statutes. It's fun reading.